So that's what's wrong, and those are some of the barriers. But I think one thing we're going to talk about today is also how people are seizing the opportunities, right, that are being presented here. And of course, so what this tells us, what we just talked about, these changes are just opportunities, but there's so many things that can stand in the way to make sure that those changes don't happen. But let's think just a little bit about some of the exciting opportunities that we heard. We heard about some great organizing that's going on already. Just a couple that we've seen that we've been charting over time. And one thing we did in 2009, we did a report about social justice organizing in the South that helped lead to a Southern Organizing Worker Group and the Neighborhood Funders Group to really focus on what are some great experiments in organizing that are happening in the South. One I think Monique can talk more about is after Katrina, right? In the last 7 years, just remarkable amount of work that's been done where new groups were thrown into action, groups that were there before got more involved, groups worked together more, and you saw not only big victories on issues related to the Katrina issue like housing, but also things that have been long-standing issues about criminal justice, right? Some big victories there. And, it's interesting, one of the leaders of that movement, Dana Kaplan at the Juvenile Justice Group, is now running for city council. And so you're starting to see this, interesting move into politics from the Katrina movement in a way. And of course, there's been a series of disasters, and I don't want to say it wrong, Monique, there's been a whole series of things that have been happening, but how this really became, and also, to an extent, where the philanthropic community, did emerge to say, hey, we're going to invest, and some good organizing is going on there. North Carolina, I think, is still a really interesting example. When they came after voting rights in North Carolina, this is one of the states where they tried to pass voter ID and restrictions on voting, eliminating souls to the polls. There was this long-standing community of good government and civil rights groups that had been working together for over a decade and had passed some big reforms like same-day registration during early voting. And these are things that, of course, expanded the electorate and actually increased political power in that state. Well, it also formed the basis for when they went after these voting rights, that they could fight that back, and they eventually won that battle. We can hear a lot more about Mississippi, where I think there's been really interesting work. When you look at issues about immigrant rights, about the way civil rights community and labor and immigrant rights groups have come together, there was a string there where they defeated some 46 pieces of anti-immigrant legislation. Finally had a big setback last year, but that's an example, and also big victories on school funding. And then, some of the interesting ways people have used messaging in deeply conservative states. And two examples that come to mind right away are in Mississippi. You remember the personhood bill? That was the first state where they're trying to go for this personhood amendment, anti-abortion legislation. Well, that was a movement, and I don't think it's been properly written up and described, but it was this grassroots movement that started with African American women working in networks to mobilize a real grassroots opposition. And of course there was support from other groups, but it was defeated from this very grassroots effort that's pretty remarkable. And Alabama actually just passed, they had a kind of austerity versus taxes debate in their state, and they voted by a 2-to-1 margin. But they weren't going to go the austerity route, that they were going to go for increased taxes to help ensure funding for their state. And so it's learning from these success stories about what worked and how they did it and how that can be built to scale and more long term. I don't know if people just want to shout. Is there another example that you think really crystallizes how groups are drawing on these opportunities that the changing South is presenting? Well, here's the last thing we're going to do, is a final kind of exercise. So y'all have kind of a basic take, right, on what some of the big trends are and the key issues. And so what we're going to do, I'm going to have y'all at your table. And if you have less than 2 people at your table, group up with another table. But this is going to be your chance. I want you to imagine you now have a chance to do your own Southern strategy. You've been given, I don't know, what's a good number, 100 million, 250 million? You've been given money to talk about how you can devise a Southern strategy. And so here's what I want you to do at your table, right? I want you to think about, and here's one hitch, because there's got to be a hitch, right? You've been told you can only focus on 3 states. It's not fair. It's wrong. You don't agree, but that's what they say. That's what they say. So that's just something you have to think about. So I want you at your table to take 10 minutes, talk about what would you choose to focus on? What states would you want to focus on? And more important, how would you go about deciding where you would want to focus that work? All right? And think about the opportunities you have, the obstacles, and what information would you need to make a good decision about that? And where would you go to get that information to help devise your Southern strategy? All right, so it's time for a progressive Southern strategy. And you got 10 minutes, $250 million. You talk about it.